All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the book of Matthew. Before we jump into the content for this session, I wanted to just make a quick announcement of something that I think will make the commentary much easier to use. We have been working on a listener's commentary app, and before long, it should be available in the App Store. It will currently only be available on iOS, that is for Apple products. I'm still trying to hunt down a Android app developer to help with taking the design we've created and coding it out for an app for Android devices. So if you are an Android developer and you love this ministry and the commentary and want to help out with that, feel free to reach out to me at john@johnwhitaker.net. Email me there and we can get in contact about that. Love to see what you're thinking. But more than that, I'm just super excited about the app because you'll be able to listen by book. You can have the feed as it currently shows up in your podcast app or your podcast player, but you'll also be able to click a little icon where it'll just list off all the New Testament books, and it'll have the books or the episodes in proper order for that book, and you can study through books that way rather than having to scroll and scroll and scroll on your podcast app to find where in the world is 2 Corinthians or where in the world is Ephesians. So that should be available in the App Store hopefully in the next few weeks. It's done being built. We're just waiting on Apple for some approval of things before it'll finally be released and available in the App Store. So be looking for that as a way to listen to the commentary in directly through its own app. All right. In this session, we are going to be looking at Matthew 22, verses 1 through 14. Jesus is in Jerusalem. He has traveled there for the Passover, what will turn out to be his final Passover. It is thus his final week before his crucifixion. And he has been teaching and healing in the temple, and this has been leading to various interactions and debates with the leaders in Jerusalem and in the temple. And that's where we find ourselves here in Matthew 22, 1 through 14. It's actually still part of the exact same interaction that began at the end of chapter 21. So it's another one of those unfortunate chapter breaks. Here, Jesus has been interacting with the chief priests and the Pharisees, which began with those leaders asking Jesus this question: by what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority? In other words, he's teaching, healing in the temple. He's overturned the tables of the money changers. He's acting very prophet-like, and they're wondering, where did you get this authority? Jesus' response to that was to ask them a question about John the Baptist and where his authority came from. They wouldn't answer that question because they realized either answer they gave is going to cause problems for them. So because of their duplicity, they choose not to answer. And so Jesus then replies, all right, fine, you won't answer my question. I'm not going to answer your question. A very common form of rabbinic debate and dialogue of the day. Nevertheless, he does then proceed to tell them a series of 3 parables. The first 2 are at the end of chapter 21, and then the third one is here in Matthew 22, 1 through 14. So the first parable was about 2 sons, and the question then was, which of the 2 sons did the will of their father? The second parable was about a landowner and vineyard workers who killed the servants and the son of the landowner they were supposed to be working for. And at the end of that, the chief priest realized he's talking about us, because a vineyard was a very common image for Israel and for the temple. So they realize he's talking about them. And then we get the third parable here in Matthew 22, 1 through 14. And that context is important because it helps us see that the original target, the primary target of the parable, is the leaders in the temple in Jerusalem. And we're just days away, as I noted, from the Jewish Passover and Jesus' execution. He knows it, Jesus does, and he's ready for it. And so now he's going toe-to-toe with these leaders. And here's the third parable. Picking up in Matthew 22, verse 1, Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, speaking to the chief priests, that's the them, right? He spoke to them again, the chief priests and the Pharisees. So it's primarily aimed at them. But remember, he's in the temple. So there's crowds of people that he's been teaching anyhow, gathered around, watching and learning and listening from this interaction. And so he speaks to them in parables, saying, verse 2, The kingdom of heaven is like a king who held a wedding feast for his son. And wedding feasts in the ancient world were massive affairs. Even if you have a wedding feast in a small village, the whole village is going to shut down and they're going to enjoy and participate in the wedding feast of this family member from their village. When you have a wedding feast from a king, that's like the greatest event ever, the biggest party ever. And everyone in the area where it's going to be hosted are going to know about it, and there's going to be lots of preparations. It's a big deal. Then you add to it the fact that theologically, throughout the Old Testament, the image of a wedding feast was often used as a picture of the great banquet at the end of days when God took his throne and began to rule over all the nations and everything was made new. That was pictured as a wedding feast. So you add that component to it, and Jesus is speaking directly to these leaders about this issue and about them and who gets to go to the wedding feast and what Jesus is up to and what God's purposes and plans are. So the kingdom of heaven, God's kingship, God's reign is going to be like a wedding feast, Jesus says, for his son. Huge party, everyone's ready. And so here's the story, verse 3. And he, that is the king, sent his servants or slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast, and they were unwilling to come. Now, we need to understand that the way these typically worked is, in the ancient world, because there was no refrigeration, you would send out sort of an initial save the date type invite, let people know, they would RSVP, so you would know roughly how many guests were going to be there, and thus how many animals would need to be butchered in order for everyone to be properly fed. So when it says in verse 3, call those who, notice, had been invited. What that means is they had received the initial invitation. They had responded positively to that to say that, yes, we will be there. Now the big day has come. The king sends out his servants, and these people are like, no, we're not going to come now. So all the preparations made, the animals have been butchered, they have been cooked, the big day is here, and it's time for people now to come. They had said they were going to be there, and they do not come. That's the force of what's going on in verse 3. And then verse 4 goes on and says, the king was like, he wanted to try again. He wanted to give him a second chance. This is the biggest moment in the city's history, right? The king's having this big wedding feast for its son. It is a massive deal where if you're invited to this, you would drop everything and come. So maybe they just misunderstood. So he's going to give them a second chance. And so verse 4, again, he sent other servants saying, tell those who have been invited, behold, I prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fattened cattle are all butchered. Everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. And again, remember, this is the wedding feast of a king who has all the authority and power. The people that he's inviting are going to be the rich and famous, the wealthy and powerful, those who should be most ready and willing and excited to come, who know most the honor that this is, and who know that to dishonor this king comes with consequences. That's who is being invited here, and everything's ready. Tell them to come. But verse 5, they paid no attention and went their separate ways, one to his own farm, one to his own business. The rest actually seized his servants, treated them abusively, and then killed them. And so in the flow of these parables, recall that we saw a similar sort of thing happening in the previous parable with the landowner of the vineyard and the vineyard workers actually killing the servants and then ultimately killing the son of the landowner. We're really dealing with the same sort of thing. Why? Because Jesus knows what's coming. He knows historically what's happened, how the leaders of Jerusalem have killed some of God's prophets and servants that he sent to them. He knows that they're going to kill him. He knows this tendency of they want to cling to their own things rather than enter into the king's kingdom. He knows all of this. And so here in the telling of the story, they killed the king's servants. They spurned the king's invitation and they killed the king's servants. Now, verse 7, the king was angry. and sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. Now, this is his way of saying, you're going to dishonor me, you're going to dishonor my kingship, not just dishonor my kingship, dishonor the son who is the heir apparent to the throne. In his mind, this is like subversive activity that signals perhaps an attempt to take over the kingdom and go their own way. So he's like, we're going to eliminate the rebels and the threat right away. So he destroys them, burns their city. But everything's still ready for the wedding feast. So look at verse 8. Then he said to his slaves or his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Right? They had spurned the king's invitation. They had treated him with utter contempt. They had dishonored and shamed him in a very public sort of way. So they weren't worthy because they rejected the invitation. So here's what the king says in verse 9. So, to his servants, go to the main roads and invite whomever you find there to the wedding feast. Go out to the highways, go out to the main roads. Whoever's standing along the roads, whoever's walking on the roads, whoever's begging along the main roads, doesn't matter. Invite whomever you find. And so those servants, verse 10, went out to the streets and gathered together all whom they found. Everybody, both good and bad, Jesus says. They invited people who were well respected, who had high honor, who were reputable, invited them. And the bad, those who were poor, those who were outcasts, those who were known as immoral, or right, people just who were not reputable and worthy, good and the bad. And the wedding hall was filled with guests. And so the banquet is ready. The wedding hall is filled. We're going to have a feast to honor the king's son. But at the appropriate moment, the king himself comes in to welcome his guests, to shake hands, right, and to check out his guests. So the king came in to look over the dinner guests, and he saw a man there who was not dressed in wedding clothes, and he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without wedding clothes?" Now, we need to reflect a little bit on that. First thing to note is that Jesus' story here is actually like another Jewish rabbi's story from the time period. A rabbi, Jewish teacher by the name of Yohanan ben Zakkai, told a story about foolish guests who were invited to a banquet like this. And they had worked clear up until the moment the banquet was supposed to begin. And so they didn't have time to go get cleaned up and put on nicer clothes rather than their work clothes. And as a result, they were not allowed into the banquet. They had to stay outside and listen to the festivities and watch from the outside as a consequence of their choice not to actually prepare for the banquet. What that shows us is this kind of imagery and this kind of teaching was used and known during the time of Jesus. And it was imagery about being properly prepared for a banquet such as this. And so this guest in Jesus' parable is there at this wedding feast, and he hasn't changed his clothes. He's wearing his old dirty rags. He's wearing his smelly work clothes. And he just figured he didn't need to. Oh, the king's inviting me. He's inviting everybody. I don't need to change my clothes. I guess I can come with these dirty clothes just are. So he didn't come prepared, properly dressed. He would show up as is. And the result is the king says, how did you get in here without wedding clothes? Now, some have wondered, well, what if he didn't have any other clothes since you invited anybody you could find? Well, there is some evidence, it's not much and it's a little bit unclear, but there is some evidence that sometimes people would be offered a change of clothes at the door in case they didn't have a change of clothes. So perhaps that's the case just being assumed in Jesus' story as well. And if that's the case, then this man rejected those change of clothes as well, figured it didn't matter, his clothes were good enough, thank you very much. However it came to be, this man has shown up at this wedding feast, and he too, just like the others who spurned the invitation, this man is treating the king and his generosity with contempt, saying, I'm just going to come just in my old dirty work clothes. It doesn't really matter. And so here's how the king responded to all this. After asking him this question, how did you get in here like this? The man was speechless. The point of that phrase is he had nothing to say to his own defense. And so the king said to his servants, tie his hands and feet, throw him into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth in that place. And when Jesus uses that imagery of outer darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth, he uses it several times in his teaching, and it seems to speak of the regret, even the resentment, and the mourning that goes with recognizing where you're at and what you have missed out on. That's the idea of this imagery. And so this man is, the banquet's in the evening, he's cast out into the darkness, out there where it's dark, and now he has all this regret and sorrow and sadness and resentment for missing out on the wedding feast. And then Jesus ends the parable with this line, for many are called, but few are chosen. Now, I don't know why translators do this sort of thing. All of a sudden, we've changed some of the language from invited to called. But the word called in verse 14 is the same word that was translated invited in the story. It's the exact same word as in the parable. So all of a sudden, we've changed it from invited to called, because apparently called sounds more theological. I'm not really sure. But that causes us to lose the connection. The parable shows us what this phrase means. Verse 14 is sort of like the moral of the story. The invitation went far and wide. That's who was called. That's who was invited to this wedding feast, right? Anybody and everybody was invited. But only those who responded to the invitation and came properly prepared and dressed for the party, they're the ones that got to enjoy the party. Those are the chosen. That's what's going on here in verse 14 in the context of this parable. Many people were invited, but only those who showed up at the party, responded positively to the invitation, and showed up properly prepared and dressed were those that got to enjoy it. They were the ones that were chosen. And what this reminds us is that just getting an invitation doesn't mean you'll necessarily enjoy the king's party. You have to respond to it and show up wearing the proper clothes that the king wants you to wear. And so let me just offer a few reflections as we wrap up this parable in this setting. First, this parable reminds us that God is preparing a great banquet in honor of his son. That's the focus of this story. The wedding feast that is pictured here is a great banquet to honor the king's son, that is Jesus himself. And so the great banquet at the end of history now focuses on Jesus, the Son of God. It's not just some general idea of God or some general idea of God's banquet. There's a specific focus, and that focus is on the king's son. Being a part of those who received the initial invitation by itself won't admit you to the party. You have to honor the son. That's really important for us to remember. Just getting an invitation, even being part of those who were initially invited, like the Pharisees and the leaders in the temple in Jesus' day, if you don't honor the son, you won't get to go to the party. The second little reflection for us to think about here is being invited doesn't guarantee admittance to the party. Being invited doesn't guarantee admittance to the party. You have to honor the king's invitation. And you have to do that by honoring the son, and by going to his party, and by coming properly dressed. And in the context of the preceding parables, since it's all one section of interaction, what we learn is being properly dressed entails doing the will of God the Father. So just being around Jesus doesn't guarantee faith in Jesus. Just being familiar with the king's son isn't the same thing as honoring the king's son. Just having received an invitation doesn't mean you're going to enjoy the party. You need to be like the first son in the first parable who does the will of the Father. You need to be like those in this parable who show up to the king's party properly clothed, properly dressed by doing the will of the Father. All right, thanks for tuning into this session on the Listener's Commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generosity of people just like you. So if you're one of those who supports this ministry, thanks a ton for your support. God is bearing good fruit through your generosity and your prayers. And if you've been blessed or impacted by this ministry, would you consider joining the team of supporters? There's so much more I want to be able to do with this, some of which just requires being able to pay somebody who has some time to do some work, and that requires funds to be able to do that. And so I would love to see this ministry continue to expand, reach more people, bear more fruit in places that maybe don't get this kind of Bible teaching very easily. And your generous support could help us do that. So if you would prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters by going to listenerscommentary.com, clicking the Give button, and you can donate to the ministry right there. Thanks a ton for your support.